Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Julia Galef. She's the host of the popular Rationally Speaking podcast, where she's interviewed thinkers such as Tyler Cohen, Sean Carroll, Phil Tetlock, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. She's an advisor to OpenAI, works with the Open Philanthropy Project, and co-founded the Center for Applied Rationality. Her 2016 TED Talk, Why You Think You're Right Even If You're Wrong, is viewed over 4 million times. I think it's over 5 million now. Anyway, her new book is The Scout Mindset, Why Some People See Things Clearly and Others Don't. And that's a big problem these days because nobody identifies themselves as not seeing the word clearly or being irrational. So we go through what she means by this metaphor of a scout mindset or a soldier mindset, and I read through the characteristics of that in the podcast. We talk about Dan Kahneman's thinking fast and slow as another metaphor and how that applies to that. We talk about how to talk to people that you disagree with or that differ from you. And then we drill down on a bunch of different issues, like empirical claims and like climate science or vaccines or whatever, and how those differ from religious beliefs and political beliefs and ideological beliefs. And it's a long podcast. We went an hour and 45 minutes because I really kind of pushed her on a whole bunch of different hot button topics, BLM and the whole anti-racism movement and in the implicit implicit association test that implies we're all racist. She's skeptical of that. We get down to talking about what it means to have implicit racism in society and how she would apply all the principles of rational thinking in her book to some of these really, really hard problems. And then we end with my challenging her to explain to President Biden how he would structure a room full of Arabs and Israelis in a conference to solve the Middle East conflict. That would be a hard one. And she's got a really, really good answer to that. So check it out. Give it a listen. Thanks for listening. And thank you for your support of the podcast, both through our advertisers as well as through skeptic.com. If you want to support the podcast, go to skeptic.com/donate, and you can support the Skeptic Society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. So your donations to support this and the magazine and our work are all tax deductible. So thanks for listening and thanks for your support. Your subtitle is, why some people see things clearly and others don't. Of course, part of the problem is nobody thinks they don't see things clearly. I had Michael Gordon on the podcast who wrote this book on science and pseudoscience and the demarcation problem. Mm-hmm. And my favorite quote from him is, no one in the history of the world has ever self-identified as a pseudoscientist. Gets up in the morning and thinks, I'm going to go down to my pseudo lab and collect some pseudo facts, support my pseudo theory.
Right.
Everybody thinks
they're
doing science. I have good science. You're the one you're the wrong skeptic. Your skepticism should go in the other direction. Right. So that's part of the problem.
Have you ever heard the definition of irrationality as the study of how other people think?
Yes, right. Yeah, right. Not me.
Anyway, that is often in the back of my mind. So one thing I'll say is that I think people are of multiple minds when it comes to, how accurate their thinking is or whether they want to see things accurately. To some extent, of course, if you ask people like, do you think you're, you perceive things accurately? They'll, for the most part say, yes, of course. And yes, I want to. And so they'll sort of endorse the idea of what I'm calling scout mindset in theory, or at least most people will. Some people actually, there's a scale, it's called actively open-minded thinking, developed by the psychologist John Barron, who I'm sure you've heard of. And it's just a measure of essentially what is your view of what good thinking entails. And so it has questions like, when you encounter evidence that contradicts your views, should you change your mind? And should you try to understand opposing perspectives? And so you would think, well, of course, everyone would say yes to these questions. They may not practice it, in practice, but of course they'd endorse those questions. But actually not everyone does. Some people say, no, you should never change your mind. You should stick to your guns. And I guess, these are people who value kind of maybe loyalty or steadfastness more than they value truth. So there is some difference even on this question of, in theory, should we be trying to perceive things accurately? But then, of course, there's also way more difference in practice and how much people live up to these ideals of truth-seeking. And so that was sort of more what I was focused on was to to what extent are we living up to these ideals and trying to motivate people to want to live up to them more?
Yeah, let me just read from my review of your book, mostly quoting you. Distinguishing the scout mindset and soldier mindset. Soldiers rationalize, deny, deceive, and self-deceive and engage in motivated reasoning and wishful thinking in order to win the battle of ideas. Now quoting you. We talk about our beliefs as if they're military positions or even fortresses built to resist attack. Beliefs can be deep-rooted, well-grounded, built on fact, backed up by arguments. They rest on solid foundations. We might hold a firm conviction or a strong opinion and be secure in our convictions and have unshakable faith in something. The soldier mindset leads us to defend.
I really like your...
Yeah. Yeah.
I like your dramatic reenactment of my words.
Yes, maybe I'll read this review audio before as a preface to this podcast. And we defend against people who might poke holes in our logic, shoot down our beliefs, and confront us with a knockdown argument, all of which maybe our beliefs are undermined, weakened, or even destroyed, so we become entrenched in them lest we surrender to the opposing position. Okay, so let me just stop right there. What if you're right? Like, for example, let's say I'm defending the theory of evolution against some, wackadoodle young Earth creationists that think the universe was invented 10,000 years ago by the creator of the universe, right around the time the Babylonians invented beer. This is just crazy. Why would I be open-minded? And, I could be wrong. Who knows? Darwin, maybe not. 50-50.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. I know I'm right. We know evolution is true. I mean, to the extent that science can prove anything, not 100%, but, So why wouldn't I defend that?
Yes. Great question. So I would say that there's a big spectrum of how confident you can justifiably be in your position on a particular issue. So on some things, I think you can justifiably be quite confident, and it would be kind of false modesty or false, epistemic humility to say like, well, I really don't know if this is true. I'm still very open to other perspectives if the question is like, is the earth flat or not? And so you're right. Yes. On some things, like, you can and should be quite confident in what the right answer is. The big caveat I'll give is that, I think people often go straight to these kind of more extreme cases where they really, the right answer is pretty clear. And they sometimes use that as an excuse to not deal with the much muddier cases. Because I think there are a lot of muddy cases where, it's complicated enough that you should actually have a fair amount of uncertainty about the right answer. And so I don't want the existence of the relatively clear-cut cases to detract from the very real and often very important, messy gray area cases. And then the other caveat I wanted to add to my answer is that I think there's a difference between being certain that someone else is wrong and being certain that your view is 100% right. And people often conflate those two. And so they'll hear, they'll listen to a critic of their perspective and they'll go, wow, that person is clearly wrong. And they're right. The critic is wrong. But that doesn't actually mean that their view is 100% right. Because it's not it's not like, if you're 90% wrong, or it's not like our two views must add up to 100%. Like, what's more often the case is that I'm, maybe I'm more right than you. Maybe I'm like 60% right and you're only 5% right. But all of us are still, significantly wrong about a lot of things. Like on the question of evolution, for example, the young Earth creationist is wrong, but, your model of how evolution works might still have holes in it. You might still be, unduly confident about how much evidence we have for pieces of the model of evolution. And it's easy to fall into the trap of insisting that, all of the pieces of the model are 100% certain just because, well, the other side is clearly wrong. But that doesn't mean that your view of things is 100% right. And it's good to be aware of that.
Yeah. And most of the big issues in life are not that well settled. And so we have to develop that scout mindset, which I'll continue reading. Soldiers are more likely to agree with statements like these. Changing your mind is a sign of weakness. It is important to persevere in your beliefs even when the evidence is brought to bear against them. Scouts are more likely to agree with these statements. People should take into consideration evidence that goes against their beliefs. It is more useful to pay attention to those who disagree with you than to pay attention to those who agree with who you agree. Scouts, Galef explains, revise their opinions incrementally over time, which makes it easier to be open to evidence against their beliefs, and they view errors as opportunities to hone their skill at getting things right, which makes the experience of realizing I was wrong feel valuable rather than just painful. In fact, Galef suggests let's drop the whole wrong confession thing and instead describe the process as updating, a reference to Bayesian reasoning in which we revise our estimations of the probability of something being true after gaining new information about it. This, quoting you again, an update is routine, low-key. It's the opposite of an overwrought confession of sin. An update makes something better or more current without implying that its previous form was a failure. Yeah, so you want to get us away from this loss aversion, right? In economic theory, loss aversion, losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. So we naturally want to avoid that. So you're telling us reconfigure the way you think about errors. They're not, failures where you lose something and therefore it's painful.
Yeah. So I spent a while thinking about why some people are so much more willing to, notice and acknowledge that they were wrong about something than other people are. And I think that a large piece of the puzzle is just the kind of the assumptions that we have about what it means to have been wrong. And a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, I think implicitly feel like if I was wrong, that means I failed in some way. I was stupid, or I was careless, or I was stubborn or something. And so that's why it's so aversive to recognize that they were wrong, and that's why they fight it. And in some cases, I think being wrong means you did something wrong. But in many, maybe the majority of cases, no, you didn't do anything wrong. Like the views you held were completely reasonable given the information you had at the time, or given the amount of time that it made sense to spend thinking about it. Like, we even the smartest human in the world, the best educated person, has limited time and processing power. And so, the conclusions you form are always going to be kind of rough sketches of the truth. And so, of course, your map of the world is going to have a bunch of, areas that need to be revised as you learn new information. That does not mean you failed in any way. And one reason I kind of emphasize this point in the book is that I feel like even people who are kind of on my side, like the other advocates of truth seeking and intellectual honesty and changing your mind, the way that they advocate that, I feel like often doesn't really help very much, because they'll say things like, it's okay to admit that you were wrong. We're all human. We all make mistakes. And
Right.
and I see what they're going for. Like I don't mean to criticize, but it still sounds like, it sounds like, yeah, you screwed up, but it's okay. No one's perfect. And, don't beat yourself up. It essentially, it sounds like, yes, you failed, but that's okay. Failure is human. And
Right.
and I want to challenge even that premise. No, I don't think you failed. I think you did, in most of the cases when you were wrong, I think you did everything right. But, you still need to update when you get new information. And that's why I said that thing about like an update in the Bayesian sense. It's not an admission of guilt or failure or anything. It just means you got new information, you incorporated it, and you revised your model, and now it's more accurate. And that's good, but that doesn't mean you were wrong to have the previous model. So that's a pattern it's a strong pattern I've noticed in, who's happy to change their mind and who isn't. A lot of it comes down to how they think about what it means to have been wrong.
Yeah, like Philip Tetlock's research on super forecasters. They're more like your scouts than they are soldiers. In fact, most of the pundits,
I talk about those in the book.
I love that this section in your book. Most of the pundits you see on Fox News and CNN and all that, they're soldiers fighting for the blue team or the red team or whatever. And therefore, they really can't update their priors when new information comes in, because that's not the point of what they're doing. And, so that part of the problem is punditry, the stuff we see of public intellectuals making statements, is not about truth seeking at all. It's about, signaling you're on the blue team or the red team or whatever.
Yeah, the incentives that you face can shape whether you're more inclined towards scout mindset or soldier mindset on a particular topic. And certainly in most areas of punditry, the incentive is not to be a scout. It's to, say things that play to the the biases and the values of their listeners and to kind of beat down the other side, often in unfair ways, but that's what their audience wants to hear, and they're not going to get any particular, benefit or reward from saying they were wrong about something or adding nuance. So that is true. Again, to add a caveat to that, I would say there are exceptions. Sorry, go on.
I was just say, just imagine Sean Hannity coming on and say, I've been rethinking this immigration thing, and I think Trump wasn't right about that. I think we need to
right.
open the borders a little bit more. This you're never going to hear this, ever.
I know. It doesn't, I can't actually picture that because my brain thinks it's so implausible that it won't form that simulation.
Right.
Yeah, so that is true. I would not look to like your typical political talk show host for examples of scout mindset or expect it from them. But the caveat I'll add to that is that there are some exceptions. There are pundits who they're not playing to the broadest audience possible. They're optimizing for a smaller, somewhat more niche, but still often sizable audience that does value, like takes changing one's mind or ability, being able to portray the other side fairly and honestly, takes those as sort of, things to admire. There are some pundits like that, some public intellectuals who I could name. And then the other thing I would say is that again, I think people often focus on kind of the worst offenders, like, the Sean Hannitys or like other people on Fox News or, I don't know, on all sides of the political spectrum, there are demagogues. And they explicitly or implicitly feel like, well, if other people aren't going to be, truth-seeking, then I'm not going to bother either. And I think they're sort of taking the worst examples of the other side and using that as an excuse to be like, well, no one's doing this, so I'm not going to either. But you could instead be looking at kind of the shining examples of, people who are being intellectually honest, even though they don't have to, or even though they could get rewarded for not doing it. And you could, use those as your role models instead of the terrible examples.
Yeah, part of the problem is the ecological, or I should say the economic landscape for punditry drives people further apart into the soldier mindset, just because that's where you get more clicks and therefore more downloads and therefore more dollars for your advertisers. Yeah,
it's true. Yeah, looking at tweets that go viral or tweets about politics that go viral is just a depressing, barren wasteland. So I get a little concerned, actually, if one of my tweets gets an unusually large number of clicks. It causes me to doubt myself. I'm like, oh God, was I being unreasonable? I should go back and revisit this. This is not a good sign.
And the other thing I think, since you use this term, the search for truth, which truth? So let me just kind of deconstruct that idea. It's probably my next book, what is truth anyway? We talk about empirical truths in science, things that we can know. Or at least hope to know, and that I make a claim and you can check my data, my experiments, you can try to replicate them. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm partially wrong, updates and so on. We can, you and I, you can look, I can look, I could take a photo, we can publish it in peer-reviewed journal. There's some social process at which we can derive, some degree of high confidence in something being true. But then what about religious truths or political truths? I'm not sure they're in the same level. If somebody says, I'm a Christian and I believe Jesus died for my sins, he was alive, he was crucified, 3 days later, he was raised from the dead. For me, and you too, if you want to read John 3:16 and accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Where's your control group? This is a crazy question. I mean, who would even think like that? Well, that's what Christians believe. And if you didn't believe it, you'd be a Jew or a Muslim or nothing or whatever, right? So I don't see how, we can hold those kinds of standards. Thus, when a Christian says, well, I'm defending my religion in a soldier mindset because this is what I believe is true, you can't prove that it's not true. I can't prove that it's true in any empirical sense. This is a different kind of truth, something like that.
Yeah, so I have so many thoughts. So one reaction is that I think some religious claims are, they are empirical propositions, and there are people who have tried to, collect evidence for that, or tried to, think about how strong the evidence is for those empirical claims, and some of them have in fact concluded actually this there's really not that much evidence for this, or the evidence is a lot more contradictory than I thought, and they do change their minds. It doesn't happen that often, but I think some religious claims really do fall under this category of they're empirical, and they can have more or less support. And if you're trying, you can start to notice how much or little their support they have. That said, there are other claims that are it's much less clear, like, what it would mean for them to be true. And so value judgments, for example, or, views about what kind of world we should be fighting for, or about how to behave ethically. It's much dicier to define, like, what would it mean for you to be right or wrong about that claim. And so I kind of avoided talking about this in the book just because it felt like it was going to be too much of a philosophical thicket to get into. But my like nutshell account of how you would like be a scout about those more moral questions is just to try to think about them as objectively as possible, which I would define as you can do like thought experiments of the type I talk about in the book, where you sort of test your intuitions to see if, well, I have this moral principle that I'm invoking now that, like, I don't know, maybe the moral principle is adultery is, someone's own business. It doesn't, like, we're not to judge or something. So maybe you feel like that's your moral principle. You could test the objectivity of that by imagining that, a politician on the other side of the aisle committed adultery. What would your reaction be then? Would you still feel like upholding this moral principle? And so you can do thought experiments to test the kind of intellectual consistency of your moral values. And that's different from testing the truth of the moral values, but I think it's still an important part. It's kind of the best you can do when it comes to trying to be a scout about about morals and values. Well, that, and you can try to be truth-seeking about the empirical questions that bear on the moral values. Like if you feel like, well, it's fine to eat meat because animals can't really suffer anyway. That's an empirical question. So your moral judgment might change if you kind of more proactively went out and tried to collect the best evidence you can about whether animals can in fact suffer and whether they do in fact suffer in factory farms. So anyway, I think there are ways to be a better or worse scout about moral questions, even though, a moral question being true or false is kind of hard to define philosophically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was just thinking of something like the abortion issue. What's the right answer there? Well, so I do that little test that you just suggested with conservatives, where they say, well, I believe in small government. It's like, yeah, you mean the military? Well, not the military. You mean like border patrol and immigration? No. We need big government. Yeah. What about the court system and prisons? Oh, no, massive. Police? Oh, we need a huge police. Yeah. All of a sudden you have a huge government. It's like, I thought you were in favor of small government. Or I believe in individual autonomy and liberty and freedom, and it's none of the government's business what I do. Oh, so women should be able to choose whatever reproductive choices they have, including abortion. Oh, well, now let's not get out of here. And gays and lesbians, whoever they sleep with is none of your business. Well, now let's not go too far here, because this could, bring down the moral fiber of America and ruin children's ideas about morality, and so corrupt the youth and so on. It's like, I thought you believed in individual autonomy and liberty. Well, except for, anyway, so none of us are consistent.
Those are good examples of the kind of, like putting one's moral judgments to the test, or, testing your moral intuitions. Although ideally you apply those same kinds of hard questions to your own views as well as other people's views. But yeah, that's the kind of category of things I'm talking about that I think is useful to do, despite the messiness of the definition of truth.
Yeah, so and abortion is a good one, because I'm not sure if there's a right answer or a truth in an empirical sense. I think you have rights, conflicting rights issues. So I'm pro-choice, but I listen to the arguments of pro-lifers, and those are pretty good arguments. It is a living organism. It is a human, a potential human anyway, potential person. Different concept. So I get that. And yeah, it's probably not a good idea to just use it as a form of birth control. I can see that. Those are good arguments. On the other hand, and then, you pile up the pro-choice arguments, and to me, the one wins out over the other, but barely. Okay, so but there's no right answer. It's not like if I can make the correct arguments, I can get 98% of Americans to agree that pro-choice is the right position. It's never going to be like, it's always going to be close to 50-50 because there's no truth to arrive at. You just kind of end up at these conflicting different kinds of truths or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I think you can often do in these conversations, and that's like a good thing to have in mind in any disagreement where you're to avoid just being overly confident that you're right, is that you can have degrees of confidence in your premises, and even on moral questions like is a fetus a moral? In philosophy, they use this phrase a moral patient, which just means a being who we should be concerned about morally, who deserves consideration in terms of whether we violate its rights or cause it suffering or things like that. And so there are genuine philosophical questions about like, are animals moral patients? Some people think there are genuine moral questions about are babies moral patients and in what sense, et cetera. And so the question of is a fetus a moral patient? I give an example in my book actually of a journalist and a friend of mine named Kelsey Piper, who writes for Vox's Future Perfect, who I think is a wonderful role model of scout mindset in many ways, like an outlier in I was going to say in journalism, but like in society in general. I really respect her. Anyway, so she was friends with so Kelsey's an atheist and pro-choice, and a friend of hers is a pro-life Catholic, and she had a lot of conversations with her friend about abortion. And it's not like Kelsey changed her mind, became pro-life. But one kind of update she made to her map of reality of the issue after talking to her friend for a while was that she decided, I really can't be 100% certain that fetuses aren't moral patients. I feel pretty sure that they're not in all the ways that it makes sense to me to define moral patient in terms of, consciousness and ability to suffer and so on, like complexity of the mind. It seems pretty clear they're not moral patients who we shouldn't worry about, violating their rights. But I'm not 100% sure. And I think the question of who counts as a moral patient is actually kind of complicated, and we should have some error bars around who we decide is or isn't a moral patient. And so, yeah, so she came away from those conversations with a little bit more uncertainty. And in terms of like the policy implications of that uncertainty, maybe you want to like try a little harder to prevent totally unnecessary abortions or to like reduce the number of abortions that happen if you have a little bit more uncertainty about the moral patienthood of the fetus, if that makes sense.
Yeah, conservatives, here I'm thinking of Dinesh D'Souza makes this argument that women that are pregnant, that want to be pregnant, they don't describe the fetus as like medical tissue or a moral patient. They just say, well, this is my baby. I'm going to have a baby. In other words, the language they use to describe it is very different. And to him and to conservatives in general, I think that's an indication of I don't know what, a different category because of whether you want it or not. So again, these are different kinds of truths. I think more generally democracy. I'm a big supporter of democracy. I think the spread of democracy is good. Okay, so we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're going to bring these people democracy. Well, and there was a logic behind Bush's foreign policy, because he said, I read Nathan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy. And Sharansky argues against people that say democracy is just not right for some nations or some people. They're just not ready for democracy. I mean, and a lot of that is kind of bigoted, racist, well, these people are, they're not educated enough. They're not rational enough to be rational voters and so on. So Sharansky knocks all those arguments down. This isn't rocket science. I mean, people just want freedom. They just want to make their own choices. And so Bush says, I read this book and I think this is good. We should spread democracy. Well, that didn't go over so good, right? Because maybe forcing people to adopt what you consider to be rational moral issues or positions is not it doesn't always work.
Yeah, I mean, you can believe both that everyone would be better off under democracy than alternatives, but also believe that people would not be better off with externally imposed democracy, and that the consequences of externally opposed attempts at imposing democracy are likely to be worse than the non-democracy status quo. that's probably where I would have come down on that. But yeah, that's a useful window into the reasoning of Bush at the time. I actually didn't know or didn't remember that.
Yeah, and well, I guess part of the problem was that they're much more tribal. These clans and extended families, clans, and tribes are very internally bounded, and therefore the idea of kind of a individual, universal voter in the entire community, the nation state, is just so foreign to a lot of people. We're just used to that for centuries of this. That that would take a long time to change those kind of cultural norms. And so here I'm thinking about, I think the last time we were together in person was that debate with Massimo Pigalucci for your podcast on,
the last?
I think so, maybe. To what extent we can derive objective moral truths from objective empirical facts, right? And as you know, myself, Sam Harris, Steve Pinker, and a few others think that we can, to some extent, maybe. And most people are skeptical. Most philosophers and scientists are skeptical. So, but if you take something like, and here I'm conflicted, I haven't fully thought this through, shouldn't adult women be able to choose to have whatever kind of sex life they want, including being sex workers, right? So then, but then when you look at prostitution as a business, as an industry, there's a lot of abuse, drug abuse, physical abuse of the women. A lot of them were teenagers, and they were abandoned or from broken homes or foster homes, and the pimps are just really assholes that are just using these women. And that doesn't seem like they're capable of making a free, rational, volitional choice as adults when they've had this horrific background. Doesn't the state have an obligation to come in and go, hey, wait a minute, this is not good, and then how do we decide that? There's just, so again, conflicting moral values, the freedom of adults to choose to do whatever they want, and the state to come in and go, you're actually not making a rational choice. And just parenthetically, I would say the same thing with polygamy. You watch these funny TV shows, Sister Wives, right? And they got this guy with 8 wives or whatever, and hilarity ensues as they navigate their complex lives, right? And but the women, they all say, "Oh, I love being married to this guy. I mean, these are my sister wives. We all get along. It's all great. There's no jealousy, and so on and so forth." But when you look at the background, well, these girls, they were like raised from the age of 5. You're like, that's the guy you're going to marry. They don't know any different. They don't know what it means to have free choice and a spectrum of degrees of freedom in life. And so there again, I'm conflicted on that. Love to have your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, so I agree that as you say, it comes down to these conflicting values of, not infringing on individuals' autonomy to choose the life that they want for themselves, and not presuming that you know better than they do about what will make them happy or oppressed. That value has to be combined with consideration of the value of what about the welfare of people who were either forced into it or who were in situations where they couldn't really freely make a choice, the best of our guess. And to me, a lot of it just comes down to the numbers, like our best estimates of what percent of women in sex work are seem to have chosen it voluntarily and don't seem to be coerced into staying in it, versus the percentage of women who are, at least this is the crux for me, is like, I could imagine finding out that, 90% of women in sex work were actually coerced into it, and only 10% are in the sort of free, voluntary, yes, I'm happy with my choices category. And in that world, I probably, even though I really do value individual autonomy, but that ratio would be probably lopsided enough that I'd say, well, I think unless we can find some way to distinguish, and maybe we can, but if we can't, then I would sacrifice the autonomy of those 10% of women in exchange for helping the 90% of women. And I don't know what ratio would be the tipping point for me, if it would be like 60-40 or I'm not sure. I haven't done those thought experiments yet, but
I don't even know what it is or if anybody has that.
And I'm sure
data.
It's hard to estimate, but yeah. But I feel like these discussions of the magnitudes are often absent in these kinds of conversations, and people, not you, but like often when people, argue for one side or the other of these issues, they're just focused on the case that sort of they care the most about, or that they suspect is the most prevalent. So they'll just focus on the women who are, being coerced or abused, or they'll just focus on the sex workers who chose this freely and, don't want that choice taken away from them. And they just kind of ignore the question of like, well, how common is that compared to the other scenario? So I wish these conversations included more discussion of, our best guesses of magnitudes, essentially.
Yeah, and there are some actual hard data, reliable data would be helpful. But if it's 60-40 or 50-50 versus 90-10, that would certainly make a difference. To me, and that on the prostitution one, you just decriminalize it and regulate it as an industry, like all other industries are regulated, just to avoid abuse and fraud and things like that. Yeah, actually, I mean, that's another empirical information side of things that I haven't really looked into very much is other countries that have decriminalized prostitution. How well has it gone, and has the abuse essentially been greatly reduced? And if so, then that's quite convincing. No, we do have some data on that, on both prostitution and drug abuse. Decriminalize drug use and put the money into that you would have gotten, just tax the sales and then use the money for addiction research and things like that, and support.
The argument against decriminalizing sex work that I really can't stand is the argument that it degrades you as a person to engage in sex work, and that this is just something that other people can judge. Like, well, of course it degrades you. You may not think it does. You may claim that, you enjoy it or you feel empowered or you don't feel degraded at all, but I can tell that it degrades you, and therefore we shouldn't let you degrade yourself. And that drives me batty because it feels like, just this very subjective intuition people have about what's degrading or what's not, that they're treating as a, universal objective truth as opposed to just their own personal subjective intuition. And I can think of plenty of things that I would find more degrading than sex work. But, or like more dangerous or more, there's just so many like very squishy arguments made about like, well, your body is being used without, consideration for your mind or your worth as a person or something. And I'm like, there's so many professions where your body is being, like as a coal miner, your body is being used to, mine coal, and it's not about valuing you as a person. It's about valuing your ability to mine coal. I don't understand how this is different. I can kind of understand how people feel it's different because we have a lot of baggage as a culture about sex. And also some people just emotionally, they do feel more degraded by, being objectified sexually than being objectified in non-sexual ways. But I wish they would acknowledge that that's not universal. So that's my rant about that.
No. That's true. As if somebody can read your mind and tell you what's going on inside your head. But I think
I don't even think they're pretending to be mind readers. I think they're just claiming that degradation is this sort of objective essence in the world that is present, whether you think it is or not.
Yeah, I think the original feminist argument was that it's not that you personally are degraded. It's just that society as a whole has objectified women as sex objects, and advertising shows, women's body parts, and men, gaga over it, and all that socialized. And you who say, but I like being a model and making money wearing bikinis or whatever, none of your business. And they go, oh, no, you don't understand. Since you were you were brainwashed into this and brought up into this objectified culture. It's the similar argument made today about intrinsic racism, and that, even though the polls all show people are getting ever less racist by the generation, that the systemic racism argument is like, even if no one in America was a racist, there were no white supremacists anymore, the structure itself, the banking system, the real estate system, racism how CEOs, it's all still in there. Yeah. I think that's the argument.
Yeah. I guess I don't feel knowledgeable enough about the systemic racism conversation to know if that's like how they would characterize it. But yeah, that sounds plausible.
Anyway,
there's also like a lot of playing with language.
Yeah, that's right.
Go on. We could talk about this.
We kind of went down a side path, but a super interesting one. So let's go back to this kind of deeper question of to what extent humans are rational or not. In my business for 30 years, I've been publishing a magazine about how irrational and crazy people are, believing all kinds of goofy things. The latest being QAnon. Okay. So you got to wonder, how does anybody hold down a job and have a career and lead a normal life and raise a family, whatever, if everybody's so irrational? And then, of course, as you know, the counter arguments that you went through all this stuff in your book. Well, maybe we're not that irrational. Maybe, with the bounded rationality or in certain when problems are presented in a certain way, we're actually pretty good at reasoning our way through things. So kind of walk us through that debate in cognitive psychology. So put Kahneman on one side, that we have all these cognitive biases and heuristics that lead us to fail at reasoning. And maybe Gert Gingerins are on the other side, or Tübingen-Cosmides and evolutionary psychology, that this is bounded rationality. If you present the problems in a certain way, people are actually pretty good at solving rational problems.
Yeah, so this debate between, to simplify, Dan Kahneman on one hand and Gerd Gingerins on the other, I'm not sure how much they actually disagree. Okay, they definitely disagree to some extent about some of the experiments that have been used to show irrationality. So Gigerenzer has objected that, I'm not going to recall the specifics right now, but basically that like people were being asked questions in really unnatural ways. And so the answers they give are wrong, but that's because you asked the question in a weird way. If you asked it in a much more natural way, they would get the right answer. So that is a like genuine disagreement over, how much do these experiments really show? But I think that if you take that away and just focus on the experiments that Kahneman and Gigerenzer agree are meaningful, there's still they still appear to disagree over whether those experiments really do show that people are irrational or not. And Kahneman's case is very simply that, look, people systematically get the wrong answers. They, systematically. Well, a good example here would be the question where people are asked, okay, which is more likely? Here's a hypothetical person named Barbara who, attends a lot of women's rights protests and like doesn't shave her legs, or I don't remember if that was in there, but something like that. And like buys all environmental products. Which is more likely that Barbara is a bank teller, or that Barbara is a bank teller and a feminist? And people, overwhelmingly say, oh, it's much more likely that she's a bank teller and a feminist than that she's just a bank teller. And that is, it's logically impossible for it to be more probable, for the latter to be more probable, because it's two conditions instead of one. It has to be a subset probabilistically of just a bank teller without the additional feminist criterion. But people get it wrong because we are thinking kind of associationally, and we hear, feminists, and we're like, oh, that matches these, anecdotes, these facts that we know about Barbara. Anyway, so Kahneman, will point to things like this and say, clearly, like the human brain is irrational in that it systematically gets a bunch of problems like these wrong. And Gigerenzer will reply like, but we shouldn't call people irrational because our brains evolved to solve a certain kind of problem that we, that we were likely to encounter in our ancestral environment. And abstract probabilities were not the kind of thing that we encountered in our ancestral environment. That's like a very modern kind of artificial construct. And so, we shouldn't blame humans for not getting the right answer to those problems. We do very well on problems that are framed in the kind of natural way that we would have encountered in our ancestral environment. And so, to me, I'm not sure they actually disagree. As far as I can tell, and I've checked this with a bunch of economists, behavioral economists, and evolutionary psychologists, and the overwhelming response I've gotten is, yeah, that seems kind of true. As far as I can tell, they agree about the fact that humans get these problems wrong, and so they will, get a bunch of modern questions wrong, and also that, humans are very good at solving problems that are very similar to the ones that we would have encountered in our evolutionary history. And the disagreement, as far as I can tell, is just about, should we call that irrational or not? And Kahneman is using the word irrational to just mean, systematically errors on some problems. And for Gigerenzer, as far as I can tell, he takes the word irrational to have a kind of judgment in it, like you should feel bad about the fact that you have this feature of your brain. And that's why he keeps defending humans by saying, but we evolved for a certain purpose. But I don't think Kahneman disagrees with that at all. I think he's just using the word irrational in a much more sort of technical, limited sense and not in a judgy sense. That's my read on the disagreement.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. The idea is that to what extent did we evolve to solve logic puzzles? And the answer is we didn't. Mm-hmm. So like
not really. Yeah.
The famous Wasson selection test is the example used for this. designed by the cognitive psychologist Peter Watson. It's an if P then Q rule. And so you have 4 cards in front of you, 2 are turned up, 2 are turned down, 2 have letters and 2 have numbers on them. I think, if it's a P then Q, let me see. The original version used cards with a letter on one side and a number on the other. And a rule like if there's a D on one side.
I never described this example because I can never remember the specifics. So good luck. I hope you do better than I do.
I had to write it down and read it out loud. If there's a D on one side, there's a 3 on the other. Which cards do you turn over to test that hypothesis? And people just go, what? And but then I think it was Tubi and Cosmides who said, all right, let's say you're a bartender. And you got 4 people sitting there at the bar, and and 2 of them are drinking alcoholic drinks, and 2 of them are drinking non-alcoholic drinks. Who do you card, right? And so that's a different kind of problem. Assuming that people are trying to cheat, so they describe this as we evolved a cheating detection module where we're looking for ways to test the hypothesis. I can trust this person, or I can't trust that person. How should I test that? And that we're better at that. Because that's a social, I think you call it ecological rationality or the ecological system.
Right, where we're good at reasoning natural. In the right environment, or yeah. But even then, like, it's not just on abstract logic puzzles like the Wasson selection test that people get that wrong and they just seek to confirm their hypotheses. It's also in real life cases that aren't, as explicitly about enforcing a rule as the drinking case. Like, I don't know, people might have a hypothesis that, well, I don't know. I've been reading some red pill stuff lately. The subculture that is focused on, I guess it's black pill stuff. Anyway, the subculture online that's focused on how, women are completely superficial and only interested in men who are tall and muscular, and if you're not those things, then your life is meaningless and you'll never find love. Anyway, so I'm just so curious about how because as far as I can tell, they're just willfully ignoring the massive amounts of real world data that disconfirms their model. They're not complete. There's a seed of the thing there that they are correctly perceiving, but they're blowing it up into this absolute rule where no woman will ever date, or ever be genuinely attracted to a man who isn't, over 6 feet and muscular. I'm just like, have you looked around the world? You're
right.
Vastly oversimplifying. Anyway, so I went on this tangent to say that one pattern of reasoning I see a lot in communities like this is never trying to disconfirm that hypothesis and only looking for confirmatory examples, and kind of feeling like they're testing the theory by looking at examples, but only looking for they'll only look for tall muscular men, be like, are women attracted to them? Yes, well, okay, but they never try to look for examples where the men aren't tall and muscular and women are attracted to them, and there are definitely cases of that, many. Anyway, so I think Tubi and Cosmides, who you mentioned, are right to point out that, look, there's some cases in which we're really good at disconfirming rules. But at the same time, there's also a lot of cases in which we still fall into the trap of only searching for confirmatory examples. So, I would still call that irrationality while withholding judgment, because I don't think it's our fault that our brains work this way. But I think it still deserves to be called irrational in the sense of systematically getting things wrong.
Yeah, again, I think there is a moral judgment we pass when we say that's just pseudoscience or that's irrational. We mean it. It's not just that you're wrong, but you're stupidly wrong or morally wrong or whatever. And that leads you to a soldier mindset. I'm not. So I'm going to defend my position even stronger.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the
things.
This
is actually one reason I've avoided using the word rationality. Sorry, just before you move on, I think I underestimated how much the word rationality or irrationality would cause this defensive or combative reaction in people, and how much associations people already had with it that would just be impossible to separate. And so that's one reason I talk about scout mindset or soldier mindset or accuracy or inaccuracy instead of rational and irrational in the book. That was definitely a response to what you're describing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good move.
You were going to say.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about, my next big book is on conspiracy theories. And so if you take something like QAnon, that there's a secret satanic cult of pedophiles drinking blood out of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., led by Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks. Okay, who in their right mind could believe this is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard? And yet, some significant two-digit percentage of Republicans say they think it's true. All right, if I said,
Republicans.
It's like almost a third.
Yeah.
29% of Republicans Republican voters last week told, I think it was either Pew or Pew or Gallup, that they think Trump is coming back this year in 2021. He'll be back in the White House. It's like these people are delusional. Yeah. How can they possibly believe this? Okay, so here's my theory I'm testing is that these are proxy truths. They stand for something else, a deeper kind of truth. Like I'm on the red team, and so if I talk you out of believing that the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria has a pedophile ring in it, did you really believe that? Well, one guy did. He went there with his gun, right? And he was surprised that there was no basement. Yeah. And then he shot up the ceiling. No one was hurt. He went to jail. But most people don't.
Definitely actually he's demonstrating a genuine belief there.
Yes, he really believed. Most people, Hugo Mercier makes this funny point about most people just left a 1-star review and gave a negative review of the pizza. The pizza was very doughy. It's like, that's what you do when you think there's a pedophile ring. Sure. They didn't really believe it. But so, for example, if I talked you out of believing this, that Hillary's not she's not a satanic pedophile. Are you going to vote for Hillary? No, you were never going to vote for Hillary, right? These people are already all in on the red team, right? They were never going to go for the blue team. So whether the QAnon conspiracy theory or any of them are true or not is beside the point. It's a deeper proxy truth for something else, that we stand for, conservative values or whatever, and you guys don't, and you're the enemy, therefore, we don't believe you. And in a way, like the climate skeptics, it's or believers, people that accept it. Some research shows that Democrats that accept climate science, they don't know much more about it than conservatives. Nobody knows much about it. It's a technical science. People send me these papers. I try to read them. I'm a social scientist. What do I know? I accept that science works as an institution for approaching the truth about some natural phenomena we can study. And those who don't believe it, they're kind of signaling, I don't really trust science. Those science authorities, they're biased, they're political, they're ideological, they have a left-wing bias. I don't trust them. Neither side knows much about, CO2 gases or glaciers or whatever. The technical thing is beside the point. It's what does it stand for?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why you find, well, I don't know about this, but my guess would be that you would find the most endorsement of very implausible things in kind of public polls or situations where the person professing belief is kind of speaking to outsiders. So they're kind of repping their team in a way, and it's especially important to kind of endorse the thing that is associated with your team, and that we'd see a different pattern of belief if it were a private poll or some private test that didn't involve making your team look good or bad to outsiders. So that's I'm skeptical of a lot of poll results on. I'm skeptical of poll results for many reasons, but one of the reasons, especially on politically fraught questions, is that it's just hard to know how much is people reporting genuine belief versus people, saying the thing that they happen to remember means their tribe is right and the other tribe is wrong. And for policy questions, often you really want to get at the former of what do people actually believe and value, separate from what they want to cheer for or boo. But yeah, entangled with all of this is a question of which sources people trust. And that's not necessarily about tribalism or motivated reasoning. That can be, you can be perfectly rational and come to completely wrong and to other people crazy conclusions if, you just, the path of updating that you took involved, early on having reason to believe that certain sources are trustworthy and you should trust them when they tell you that scientists are lying. And so it can be a valuable exercise. I try to do a lot of asking myself, this thing that it seems crazy for someone to believe, can I envision a path by which someone could, a reasonable person who is updating reasonably, can I envision a path by which they could come to believe it? And usually that path goes through, getting unfortunately misguided advice about which sources are credible and which aren't.
So describe the outsider test. How does that affect our reasoning?
Yeah. Yeah, so the outsider test is one of a set of thought experiments that I talk about in the book as ways to kind of test your judgments for objectivity, for scout mindset. And so the outsider test is essentially just imagining that that someone else is in the situation that you're in, and then noticing how you would, what you think they should do, or how you would evaluate their actions if it was someone else and not you. And so, a simple example of this might be, say you're a manager and there's an employee who's been just performing terribly for months, but you really don't want to fire him. And so you're coming up with reasons why, well, maybe if I wait another month, he'll, improve. Or maybe if I just gave him this kind of push, he'll improve or something. Maybe that's true. Or maybe you're rationalizing and you actually should fire the person. So you can do an outsider test and just imagine, okay, suppose, my friend's a manager. Suppose he came to me and told me about this employee who had, made these mistakes over this length of time. Would I think he should give that person another chance? And I'm using this example because I spoke to a bunch of managers who told me the same version of this, or like different versions of the same story, where they kind of did this thought experiment, or in some cases actually talked to another person who had gone through the same situation, and they noticed, oh, wow, if it was someone else who had to fire the person, it would be clear to me that, like, yeah, you got to let this person go. They're not going to get better and they're holding everyone back. But it's just, so all you're changing is who is the person in the story? Is it me or is it someone else? And your reactions can be very different. There are other thought experiments that are more, more political, for example, like the double standard test, or can be used in political contexts, where your politician does something that you think is fine, and people should stop getting on his case. And you imagine, well, if someone from the other side had done that, how would I react? Would I still think it was fine, or would I be calling for his head and saying that's a impeachable offense? So these are just examples in this category of thought experiments that can help you notice, because it's very, soldier mindset is very invisible from the inside. You just feel like you're being reasonable and objective and, a critical thinker. And you don't really notice how much you're kind of twisting shoehorning the facts into one narrative, or how much you're, bending over backwards to justify something that you otherwise wouldn't. You don't notice that until you kind of do this comparison to the counterfactual where, it's the other side, or it's, a conclusion that's not favorable to me, and then notice that you would be tempted to reason differently in that counterfactual world. So I like thought experiments, partly just on the object level, like they can help me think more clearly about a particular thing, but also because they, doing thought experiments helps drive home to me that my brain is really good at picking and choosing criteria or principles depending on the outcome that I want to get. That's a good thing to realize about your brain, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking about John Rawls's thought experiment about how you would design a fair and just, the veil of ignorance. You don't know which category you're in when you write the law. If you're male or female or black or white or whatever, you got to make it as fair as possible. That's as simple as cutting the piece of cake for two children. You cut it,
I was
the other
just
one
going to
chooses.
say, it's like a fancy version.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Although, what's interesting about the veil of ignorance, sorry to interrupt, but this is like a hobby horse for me. What's interesting is that Rawls's conclusion, so he was like, okay, surely if everyone did this thought experiment of the veil of ignorance and they didn't know what role or what socioeconomic rank of society they were going to be born into, surely everyone would conclude, oh, well, then we want a society that's as equal as possible. So I minimize the chance of being poorer than average or being really poor. That was his conclusion. To him, that was like, well, obviously everyone would conclude this, but actually, no. People have very different attitudes about risk, for example. And some people are more risk-seeking than Rawls apparently was, and they would say, no, I'd rather, have a 30% chance of being better off and a 30% chance of being poorer off. I prefer that gamble to the certainty of being exactly equal to everyone. And it just comes down to your individual preferences. So I just thought that was so funny that he had the kind of abstract reasoning prowess to design this thought experiment, But then he failed at the point where he was like, well, of course, everyone will conclude such and such.
Yeah, I think
anyway.
they're mistaking equal outcomes versus equal opportunity. Which your higher risk taking people would just prefer equal opportunity, just let the chips fall where they may. No unfair laws that are holding people back based on characteristics they were born with. Yes, we got to eliminate those. But equal outcomes is an entirely different thing and much harder to implement.
Yeah. I mean, some people might still prefer, taking their chances with unequal outcomes and they might, still prefer the shot of like getting more.
But that is one of the core differences between liberals and conservatives. Liberals tend to lean slightly more toward, well, we want to make sure the outcomes are fairer. And conservatives are like, forget the outcomes, just let the chips fall where they may, as long as the opportunities are all equal. Anybody is free to do whatever they want. Now, of course, the counter to that is, but it's never been free, until just say recently, Jim Crow laws all the way up to the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act and so forth in the 1960s. And it's still not free. You're still not free to just lift yourself up by your bootstraps. That's the counter arguments to which conservatives say, yes, it's pretty equal now. And back to the sort of anti-racism movement saying, no, it's systemic. Even though most whites are not racist anymore, it's still baked into the system and it's not free. And so there you end up with these debates. What do you mean by free or fair or just or equal?
Yeah. I was just going to say an additional counter argument that I often hear that kind of holds, even if you think that there's no systemic racism at all, an additional counter argument is like, well, people are, some people are lucky enough to be born, smarter or more conscientious than others. And some people are, lucky enough to be born into families that like teach them good habits and other people aren't. And so there's still a ton of unfairness, baked into the process, even if society gives everyone equal opportunity.
Yeah, luck plays a huge role. I mean, just the fact that you're born in America and not, say, Somalia. Talk to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, what it was like to be born and raised in Somalia. Oh my God, lucky me. Born in California, right? Yeah. And how tall you are, how good looking you are, just your genetics for athletic ability or IQ. All these things make a big difference. And again, short of a handicapper general, like in Kurt Vonnegut's novel, where everybody is held back or boosted up so that everybody's equal, it's just not going to happen. It's impossible.
Yeah. I never found the sort of fairness argument for equality of opportunity all that compelling because of the sort of genetic lottery problem. The argument I find more compelling is that equality of opportunity just leads to better outcomes overall compared to trying to make the outcomes equal. And I have some uncertainty around that, but that's how you would get me on board with the libertarian paradise is,
the libertarian paradise,
giving me pretty good evidence that
no utopias. There's no utopias.
Reasonable evidence that
better than it was. Not perfect, but better than it was. Yeah. People mistake the idea that there's progress, therefore it's perfect. No, there's progress and there's still problems. Those things can both be true. Right.
Those do seem to be hard for people to hold those two in mind.
That's right. Well, Richard Dawkins calls that the tyranny of, what was it? The tyranny of binary thinking, or the tyranny of discontinuous thinking. That is, the mind just goes to this. It's either all this or it's all that. It's black and white. And we're good at doing that, but most of the world is not like that. And so you have that, most of it's on a continuum. Okay, other things we could do to improve our group thinking. I always loved the idea of Doris Kearns Godwin's book, The Team of Rivals. I always cited that. You're the first person I know that actually looked up, or wherever your source was for that, how long the Team of Rivals lasted in Lincoln's cabinet, right? So and Obama even praised him. I think he didn't even look it up. Most of them didn't last very long because it's hard to do, right? It's hard to be in a room full of people that disagree with you.
Well, I don't deserve all the... I don't deserve all the credit for that because it was, I wish I could remember his name, but a historian who wrote an op-ed some years ago, basically pointing out, like, actually the Team of Rivals, like the cabinet that Lincoln formed after he was elected president, in which he put all of his political rivals, the people who'd run against him for the Republican nomination, that's not a great example of the principle that it's always used to uphold, like that it was used to illustrate in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, that, good to have dissenting opinions in your inner circle so that you can, better solve problems together, because it actually went terribly. And, 3 out of the 4 rivals, either contributed nothing or actively undermined Lincoln until he finally got frustrated and fired or ignored them. And only one of them was a partial success in that he helped Lincoln by giving him dissenting opinions. But this is not the success story it seems to be. Anyway, so I read that up and I was interesting. And then I went and checked what this guy was saying and realized it was true. And so I just have this sort of side tangent in my book about how, the idea of it's an impressive story for other reasons, because Lincoln kind of had the equanimity to do this maybe politically advantageous thing of giving his rivals political positions, and he was able to deal with it much better than most people would. But it's not a good example of how to, learn from opposing perspectives. Because if the people that you're engaging with are people who actively hate you and don't have any kind of camaraderie with you or shared premises, or, don't even think that they're fighting for the same thing as you, it's going to be really hard to learn from those people in useful ways. And you should instead be looking for people who have substantive disagreements with you, but who you have at least a little common ground with, who, you respect their intelligence or scholarship or their character, or, you're fighting for the same thing to some extent. Maybe you just disagree about how. And those are the areas, the really rich veins where you're likely to actually learn from opposing perspectives, as opposed to just finding the guy who's yelling at you from across the aisle and trying to learn from him.
So to avoid obedience to authority and conformity effects, is it better if the boss is not in the room when you have a committee that's trying to make a decision for a company, and because everybody's going to be afraid to say something if the boss is sitting there?
Probably, although in practice that might be tough if you need the boss in the loop on conversations. I would just advise for the person in charge to kind of go out of their way to show that they welcome dissent or disagreement, and not just to pay lip service to that, but to actively thank and praise people who do venture a disagreement, because that's what people are watching. They're not just listening to your words in which you say, of course I welcome disagreement, because those are often hollow and people are right to not take that at face value. They're watching what you do and how you actually react when people disagree with you. And so it really is important to lead by example. And then I would also say there's a fair amount that you can do that to discourage anchoring. Like if you're making a group decision, a thing that often happens is one person tosses out an idea, and then for various social reasons, everyone kind of latches onto that and they're like, yeah, great, we should do this, right? Any disagreement? And you can often avoid that pitfall by having people independently write down their opinion or their guess before you start discussing it. So at least you have a record of what people thought independently before they heard other people's ideas. So I've done that with colleagues before. I find that really helpful. There's all these different pitfalls in group decision making, but that's one of them.
Yeah, let's talk about social media companies and the whole problem of misinformation, disinformation, Russian bots, whatever, kind of polarizing people. And to what extent do you think social media companies are responsible for this? Should they be like newspapers with editors screening material, or are they more like phone company platforms and they don't have any responsibility? Clearly, we're in the middle of a huge debate on that. And then the deeper issue is, to what extent do you think voters really are influenced by what they read online, and that it's a serious problem, or it's not really a serious problem? People are making their decisions for other reasons.
Yeah. So as far as I've seen, the evidence suggests that social media doesn't have a huge impact on people's voting decisions. That there's a lot of sharing and reinforcing of opinions, and a lot of I would find it much easier to believe that social media helps increase polarization and distrust of the other side than to believe that social media actually causes people to vote in ways they wouldn't otherwise have voted. I like reading Kevin Drum. He used to write at Mother Jones, and now he writes at Jabberwocky.com, I think is anyway, it's called Jabberwocky. Just look for Jabberwocky and Kevin Drum. And one thing that he keeps emphasizing is that social media companies get criticized a lot for allowing the spread of misinformation, and especially divisive misinformation. But Fox News is far more responsible for this than social media companies are. Like if you look at the effect sizes, and he was like, it's weird that, Biden the other day like condemned Facebook or maybe all social media companies for
Facebook is
allowing the
killing
spread of
people.
misinformation about vaccines or COVID. Yeah, but Fox News has done far more towards that than Facebook has. And it's, I don't know, maybe tech companies, I don't know what it is, either that tech companies are sort of a popular scapegoat now, or possibly it's that the people saying things like this think tech companies are more malleable. Like we might actually be able to influence them to change more than we'd be able to influence Fox News. And so that's why we're harping on them more. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I definitely don't think they deserve as much blame relative to other actors like Fox News as they get.
Well, part of it is
and then
power.
In terms of
part of it is power and money. Like in conspiracy theories research, one of the drivers of conspiracism is the fear that somebody has a lot of power. So most conspiracy theories surround major corporations or major governments or government agencies, or rich people. Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, whoever. They're doing something. They got a lot of power.
Surely Rupert Murdoch is rich, though.
Rupert Murdoch, yeah. So
I mean,
and to be fair, a lot of corporations and government agencies and rich people, they do kind of conspire and rig the system in favor of themselves. There's been enough of that historically. It's reasonable. I call this constructive conspiracism. It's reasonable to be skeptical or suspicious of these people because there's just think of the Volkswagen emissions cheating scam, right? I mean that we're not surprised that companies do these kinds of things, right? That's a kind of conspiracy. Or all the the shenanigans revealed by WikiLeaks and before that the Pentagon Papers. Every administration lies to the American people. They do, all of them. And so it's like, okay, why should I believe them on vaccines or whatever? Look at the crap they were telling us about the Vietnam War.
The Epstein, the Epstein thing, right? I think for a lot of people were like, well, it's not quite so crazy to think that there's a conspiracy of, elite pedophiles. The tricky thing, though, is just that there's often a leap made from the genuine conspiracies to far more crazy conspiracies that I think is not justified. Where I'm like, okay, yes, so the Tuskegee Experiment, in which officials in the 20s, 30s.
30s and 40s.
Lied to black patients in Tuskegee, and claimed they were treating their syphilis when they actually weren't. That was horrible, obviously, and I think that should increase the probability you put on nefarious lies from the government to some extent. Like the fact that was long ago, I think should weaken the strength of the evidence or weaken the update you should make about conspiracies today. And it's sometimes used to justify like, well, Tuskegee happened, therefore it's reasonable to think that like the CIA created COVID and is now infecting everyone in the country with it or something. Like, to me, that's like way too big of a leap to make. And the existence of Tuskegee does not provide much evidence for the plausibility of that conspiracy theory. But it's hard to articulate to people, how much it's reasonable to update. There's not like clear-cut rules. And it's more of a like, I know it when I see it, that people are updating way too much from, the conspiracies that do exist. So I don't know. I'm sure you've thought about this for your upcoming book.
Well, there are the race differences.
What we learned from existing conspiracies.
That's right. The race differences in conspiracism is not how much conspiratorially minded you are, but which conspiracy theories you embrace. So African Americans are more likely to think that the government planted crack cocaine in inner cities or created AIDS to decimate African American populations. Whites are more likely to suspect that the Second Amendment is going to be abolished and Obama's creating concentration camps in Texas to put citizens that own guns in these camps. And, so it depends on, which your particular thing is. But in a way, I was thinking about, again, this proxy truth thing. I was thinking about the OJ trial. The evidence is pretty overwhelming. OJ killed his wife and her friend, right? And so, but yet the jury voted to acquit. Why? It was really based on a conspiracy theory. OJ's defense team concocted this conspiracy theory that the police planted evidence against their client. This is not a completely crazy idea if you look at the history of the LA police and the African American community going back to the 1950s. They did a lot of crap like that, right? Well, we don't know if this is the guy, but he's probably one of the guys that does something bad, so let's frame him.
Yeah.
Right? And there was enough of that to go on that I think that by the 90s, the African-American community says, hey, he probably killed his wife, but, we're getting back because we've been conspired against for decades. And so it's plausible. Mm-hmm. The police planted the bloody glove and so forth, and the blood splatter and whatnot. It's not completely crazy. In that kind of way, I think a lot of conspiracy theories make sense to people that outsiders like us go, what are you talking about? Pedophile ring, this is crazy. But no, there's something deeper, Republicans, we don't trust Democrats, whatever. And so, it's a setup for that. It's a proxy for that.
So I don't remember the specifics of the OJ case very well, but is it your impression that the jury genuinely thought like there's a non-negligible chance that this was planted? Or is it your impression that the jury didn't necessarily think that, the police had framed OJ, but were so annoyed at the police for having, behaved poorly in other ways that this was their forget about the guilt of OJ. We're not gonna like condemn someone based on police testimony because screw the police.
Yeah, it was more
one or the latter.
Observers at the time felt it was a form of jury nullification. That is, we are doing what we think is the right thing to do in general, not in this particular case. Yeah,
I see.
I mean, it was so obvious he killed that he did it. I mean, it's just everybody knows he did it. He knows he even said I did it. Wrote that book. If I did, it's crazy.
Hypothetically.
But again, I think there was a lot of sympathy. Yeah. Like, okay, we get it. The African American community in Southern California has really gotten the bad end of things for a long time. So it's kind of payback, and not just long time, but I mean, this really started with the Rodney King beating and the 4 cops that got off. I mean, we have a video. You could see they're just, beating the crap out of this guy. He's just lying there. And it's like, come on. I mean, it would be almost like if Derek Chauvin got off. I mean, it would have been, just crazy. We could all see he killed him. It's right there. Come on.
Yeah.
And, so when those 4 cops were acquitted, there were riots, and understandably so. It's like, come on, this isn't, a he said, she said. There's the video, right? So it was a sense of a little bit of payback, and understandable. Like, okay, we get this.
I know. I wish people tried harder to be specific about like who's getting the punishment for which crime, and like. There's a lot of, these people did something terrible and weren't punished, so we're going to punish this person, or we're going to, give this person the benefit of or acquit this person as sort of indirect payback or something. And I don't feel like the scales of justice balance that way. But no, I recognize that
they don't. But it's a
like
human
a very
impulse.
common human instinct.
Yeah, revenge is a deep human instinct. That everybody has, and this is what this leads to these escalating feuds between the Hatfield and the McCoys. There's 100 like that in history.
Yeah,
that's just inevitable. Again, I agree with you that it needs to be specific. I'm worried about that now with this kind of idea of systemic racism. And that this was all triggered by the George Floyd killing. And so clearly Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, no question about it. And I'm glad he was found guilty because he was. But this idea that, well, all cops are racist. No, they're not. And maybe they used to be, it used to be like maybe 80-20 in the 50s and then 60-40 in the 60s and then 70-30. Now it's like maybe 1% of cops are just white supremacist racist assholes. But most of them are just good people.
Depends on your definition of racist, of course. If your definition is, implicit enough that, the person themselves wouldn't even be aware of it, then you might get much higher than 1%.
Right. Well,
but yeah, I see what you're saying.
Then there's that problem with that implicit association test, which implies that we're all racist.
Yeah.
Because we respond quicker or slower to images and associated with negative words. You know about this test. But that test has not survived the replication crisis very well. And that it may just be measuring reaction time to things you're familiar with versus things you're not familiar with.
Right.
And instead of like some implicit racist attitudes. My problem with it is that how can we make more moral progress in society if you just say, well, it's all racist? No, I need to know which cop did what and fire that guy or jail him if he did something illegal.
Yeah.
Not just let's just defund the police or whatever. That's not going to be helpful. Like this is like Starbucks, shutting down all, 7,000 stores and 750,000 employees or whatever it was to go through sensitivity training because that one manager at that one Starbucks called the police on the two African Americans who were loitering, as if no one ever loiters in a Starbucks, right? I mean, that was a bad thing. I don't know what that manager's problem was or what the issue was, but it's not like Starbucks has a problem. No, that person right there, that's the problem. If that's true, so that's where we should target it. And but again, that's not a popular position at the moment.
Interesting thing for me is that I also don't think, from what I've read, the implicit associations test is just not. It's just pretty shoddy, and we should not be relying on it or basing training on it or anything like that. But at the same time, I think that implicit bias is like probably quite common and real and impactful in a lot of ways. And that's just like based on sort of common sense, real life experience and like, I don't know, just watching how people react to things and even doing thought experiments myself. Like sometimes I'll do a thought experiment where I imagine like hearing the same speech from someone, who's a different race or a different like socioeconomic class or, different gender or something. And I do notice like, oh, I'd be like more inclined to give that person the benefit of the doubt, or I'd be more skeptical or something. And I don't think I'm like, way more racist or bigoted than average. So I assume if I notice like these differences in my implicit reactions, they're probably pretty common. So like, it's an unusual position I often take where I'm like, my best guess is implicit bias is probably pretty common, but also I think the implicit associations test should never be cited and is not good evidence of implicit bias. I think both of those are probably true.
I think that's right, and it's probably true. We all harbor some kind of generalizations about other people because we do that for everything, right? I mean, you can't know everything.
Like,
you can't collect all the data that comes in through our senses and just filter it. I mean, we use these heuristics. Stereotypes are a form of heuristic, and usually they're not harmful.
Right.
They're just generalizations we make about dogs or whatever. But when it comes to people and gender or race, then of course that's that's a hot button issue because we want a fair society and a just society. So again, it comes down to, well, what's the criteria you're using? And maybe polls aren't reliable, but the polls have shown, for example, they used to ask, if an African American moved into your neighborhood, would you move out? It's hard to believe anybody would even ask that today, but that used to be a common question. Or do you think blacks and whites should be allowed to marry? That was illegal until 1967.
Right.
Illegal. It was against the law. I mean, it's astounding. and now pollsters don't even ask. I mean, you'd be like, what are you talking about?
Right. They must have some polls about that, but I from whatever I've seen, it's gone way, way, way down. Like, a tiny fraction of what the numbers used to be for being, opposed to interracial marriage or.
And I think gay marriage will go the same way. I think in another decade or two, no one will care.
That way, yeah.
Yeah, no one will care. Even evangelicals will go, yeah, whatever, dude, I don't care. God loves everybody.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is another one of those things where people my sense is that people are very unwilling to acknowledge that there's been a lot of progress made on these like explicit kind of dramatic indications of racism, like explicitly opposing interracial marriage. That they're unwilling to acknowledge that because I think on some level they fear that would undermine the other point that like there's still a fair amount of implicit bias that matters that we should be trying to get rid of, or there's still a fair amount of like racism after effects of slavery or Jim Crow or racism baked into our systems that is important to address, and that they won't be able to make that point compellingly if they say that like it is better that people are no longer mostly opposed to interracial marriage. And that's a hard rhetorical knot to untie. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and if your criteria is if there's any differences between blacks and whites anywhere, number of CEOs or congressmen or whatever your criteria is, number of home ownership, income, salaries, whatever, then the assumption is that, well, those differences can only be explained by, some kind of racism. Yeah, well, we're mostly not racist anymore. Okay, implicit racism, or it's baked into the system. But even there, see, for example, there used to be the problem of redlining, right? Banks giving home ownership loans based on these red lines drawn around these neighborhoods that avoided African American communities. That was clearly a form of discrimination that you could see right there in the paperwork, and so laws were passed to get rid of that. Perfect. So when somebody says, well, but it's still there, it's like, where? Exactly. I mean, just point the problem. And if it's illegal, well, then we should change that, right? If it's truly discriminatory, then change it. Otherwise, what are we doing? We're just talking. It's like, or just virtue signaling, like when Princeton University issued that statement last year. We're implicit in the racism of America. We've done bad things, and and the the Trump administration said, "What exactly did you do? Because if you're in violation of federal laws against discrimination, we're going to withhold funds from you, and you're in big trouble." And they're like, "Oh, well, we haven't actually done anything specific. We're just kind of responsible for the century-long, racism of America." Okay, well, that's a very different, kind of statement to make.
Yeah, I remember a freshman class I took on Israel and Palestine. It was taught by a Palestinian professor, and one sort of section of the class was about sexism or misogyny. And the whole point of the readings he chose and the discussion he led was that Israeli society treated women much worse than Muslim society, and he picked he picked some examples of sexism in Israeli society, and in any society you're going to find some sexism. So he found some examples of gender discrimination at Israeli companies, and then he also picked some examples of Palestinian women. I forget now, it's been too long, but Palestinian women talking about how fulfilled and respected they were or something. And I just remember being just boggling that he was trying to make the case that it was better for women in in Palestine than Israel. And I think, I can only assume that I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but my best guess is that he felt like there was the current state of discourse was too anti-Muslim when it came to women's rights, and not appreciating the problems that women face in Israel enough. And so his way of pushing it towards the truth was to, go too far in the other extreme and, try to make the opposite case. And maybe on some level he felt like that was the most truth-seeking thing to do, because then people would be pushed more towards the accurate truth. But anyway, I bring this up because I see this kind of thing a lot where people make a kind of implausibly exaggerated case that I feel like on some level is them trying to push against an exaggerated case in the opposite direction. And it's just an unfortunate equilibrium we fall into, where people feel like they have to, stretch the truth in one direction to compensate for other people stretching the truth in the other direction. Then people react to that, and it's just a big old mess.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of earlier in the conversation about polygamy and prostitution and so on, and what to what extent women are choosing. So I'll just use this example at a TED conference. I think it was 2010. Sam Harris and I were both speaking, and Sam got up and gave this was based on his new book, The Moral Landscape. So he has this picture of these Muslim women in the burqa, the complete whole thing, right, with just the little islets. And he describes them as, being forced to wear these bags. These women are in these cloth bags. This is so restrictive, and the way he says, he's so eloquent. But I could see Chris Anderson, the owner of TED, the head of TED, he was like, what? And he got up there and kind of pushed back, and Sam and him, you can watch this online, Sam and him went back and forth a little bit. Now, I can see that's one of those things, I don't know. Are they really forced to wear? Because if you ask Muslim women, why do you wear these particular clothing? I've asked Muslim Mormon women, why do you wear these secret underwear? Ha ha ha! Atheists make fun of that. But I was told by some Mormon women, this isn't secret underwear. This is just modesty. This is what we do, and I feel better about it. I like wearing these clothes, and a lot of Muslim women will say, I like wearing the burqa. It's modesty. Modesty is a good. Look at you, American women, running around in these bikinis that are essentially just bras and panties. I mean, come on. That's not decent. So there, it's not clear what's the truth. I mean, it's these cultural norms, and that feels different still than, say, female genital mutilation of these young girls, which is, should be just a crime, different still from the burqa. Anyway, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, it's very tricky when you have people claiming that the state of society is good and they don't want to change it. And you really, really suspect that they would feel differently if they were, had more education or had more autonomy or had experienced the alternative, that they would, choose differently. And, as someone who really values individual autonomy and like really wants to avoid coercing people, this is especially tricky for me because you have these two potential risks to individual autonomy. There's like the women whose autonomy is being trampled on and they're claiming, no, this is how things should be. This is how I want things. Don't change it. And so, you want to give them more autonomy, but you also don't want to violate their autonomy by giving them more autonomy. And it doesn't feel like there's any sort of way to err on the safe side. But yeah, the only heuristics I can really rely on are like, I'm more inclined to just trust someone that they want things to stay the way they are. The more freedom they have to actually make that choice. And the more information they have, like, because it's not really a free choice if you don't have all the relevant information. And so never easy call to make, but I would be more inclined to go against someone's wishes if they had very little information and very little freedom to make that choice. But I don't think there's a clear-cut answer.
And then along those lines, let me just ask you your position on free will and determinism, since you study influences of human behavior.
Just ending on a light note.
Yeah, just a light note. There's no emotional attachment
light
to the either answer.
Question.
Yeah. So, free will and determinism.
That's the question.
Do humans have volition? We have all these determining power, genes and our upbringing, the environment and culture, and all the heuristics and cognitive bias. How is it we're ever able to make a free choice? Are we actually ever even making free choices?
I am confused about how to define free will. I feel like the conversation is confused, and the reason it feels hopelessly confused to me is that any way of talking about free will seems to lead to a contradiction. Like if we say that, well, we don't have free will if we're subject to the laws of physics, then I can't imagine a even conceivable universe in which we would say that we had free will. Like whether our actions are followed, deterministic processes, or whether they're non-deterministic, any way you can imagine it, we would look at that and go like, well, but it wasn't really free will because, things resulted from prior states of the universe, or, well, it wasn't really free will because it was just determined randomly. Like, so to me, that thought experiment where you imagine the universe running differently and ask yourself, well, then would I consider us to have had free will? And never is the answer like, yes, that would be free will. That to me indicates that there's something wrong with the way that we're thinking of the idea of free will. But I don't, I don't know whether the conclusion from that is that we don't have free will, or that we should just abandon the concept of free will altogether. I'm sorry, I don't have a really coherent answer for you.
I would go for the latter. I think it's conceptually confused. People just have different meanings about these words. They're just words, right? But somehow we pack a lot in there, and it depends how you define these things, right? So there's no libertarian free will. Almost nobody thinks that, where there's a little homunculus in your head making decisions. And if there were, that doesn't help you at all.
Even if there were, like, what's causing the homunculus's decision?
Right,
like,
exactly,
there's no, there's no way to.
But on the other hand, you're aware
hypothetically set it up.
You're aware that there's all these influencing factors. You can take a debiasing course. You can read your book and go, okay, I'm going to be careful of my motivated reasoning. Going forward, the future Shermer is not going to be subject to those biases because I'm aware of it now. So I see that as a kind of a choice. I'm aware of the factors impinging on my freedoms, and I can tweak the variables around a little bit going forward. So the future Shermer is a different person than the current Shermer, and we're all like that. It's a kind of freedom, but it's, again, what do you mean by these words?
Yeah, if we're not talking about free will in the sort of like, pure philosophical sense, and we're just talking about like how much autonomy do I have as an individual to direct, like to control my destiny, then I think there are like degrees of free will in that more colloquial sense.
Degrees of freedom,
degrees of freedom, maybe if we avoid the phrase free will. This is one thing that I really loved about the book The Robotic Rebellion by Keith Stanovich.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Which I've plugged elsewhere. So I don't agree with all of it, but basically he talks about the kind of fast and slow thinking that Kahneman talked about several years later in Thinking Fast and Slow. And Stanovich's point is essentially, a lot of our judgments and decisions are the result of this kind of automatic, fast system one thinking. And if we start to rely more on this sort of deliberate, careful, slow system two thinking, then we are actually taking more control of our own destinies, because we're essentially like the metaphor of the book is that humans are like robots that were built by our genes over the course of many, many millennia, and by becoming more self-aware of our own thinking and how we form our judgments and how we decide what to do or what to want, by becoming more self-aware, we're like robots who are rebelling against our creators and saying, no, I want to direct my own life based on my own goals as an individual and not based on what my genes thought would be best for me or wanted, which was, their own proliferation. I'm not saying it as well as Stanovich did, but basically it caused me to think about metacognition, about like being more aware of how you think about things and how you're forming your judgments in the first place. It caused me to see that in this kind of exciting terms of empowerment, that like by becoming more aware of our thinking, we're taking control of our own destinies and not just following whatever automatic course our genes kind of laid out for us. And I find that so inspiring. I know not everyone does.
I like that. What's the name of that book?
But to me, that's like kind of the emotional core of metacognition.
Yeah. What's the name of that book?
It's called Robotic Rebellion, or The Robotic Rebellion by Keith Stanovich.
All right. Yeah. I'm going to check that out.
And I have some disagreements with the way he talks about the roles of System 1 and System 2, but that like core emotional message really resonated with me and stuck with me.
Okay, last question. If you get this one right, you can win the Nobel Peace Prize. All right, so President Biden reads your book and he calls you up on the phone, or I should say his staff calls you and says, please hold the line for President Biden. And he says, all right, Julia, we have a big conference at Camp David. I have the Arabs and Israelis coming. I'm going to sit them all down in the same room. What do I do to make the peace? So again, if you can figure this one out and get it right, you win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh God, I feel like anything I say to this is just going to sound so cringy and naive. But or
you can pass because no one knows the answer.
Well, I'll give it a good shot. Just,
okay, good.
Just let me lampshade this, as I'm sure it's terrible. I guess I'd have him, and this would be an entertaining experiment, regardless of whether it helped. I'd have him try to get the Israeli and Palestinian representatives to pass each other's ideological Turing test, which is it's a phrase coined by Brian Kaplan that I talk about a little bit in my book. So in its pure form, the way you pass an ideological Turing test is by explaining the other side's position, like why they believe what they believe, or what they want and why, explaining it so well that an outsider couldn't tell whether they couldn't tell that you don't actually believe it yourself, because you were able to explain all the details and also to articulate it in a way that's not like a caricatured straw man. So like if you're a liberal talking about like what conservatives believe, and you say like, well, yeah, conservatives believe that poor people are all terrible and deserve to die. Like no one would believe you're actually a conservative when you say that. So you would not pass an ideological Turing test. And so being able to pass the other side's ideological Turing test won't necessarily make you agree with them or like them, but it at least forces you to confront the kind of straw man that you had of their view, and to recognize when things are more complicated or nuanced, or sometimes more reasonable than you thought they were. So then you can actually disagree with or engage with the real thing that they think and not your straw man of what they think. So that would be an entertaining thing to watch.
That would be great. Yeah. No, that's actually be a great way to start. I bet they'd have a hell of a hard time doing it though. Because the other side would go, no, that's not what we're arguing. That's not what we believe. Okay, let me try it again. No, you're still getting it wrong. It is hard to do. All right, Julia, thank you so much for coming on the show. Give us an idea. What are you working on next? What's your next big project?
I don't actually know what my next big project is. I've kind of just been taking it easy, doing a lot of publicity for the book, and working on my own podcast, Rationally Speaking.
Oh, yes, that's right. Good. Yes, people should check that out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you like this podcast, I think there's a reasonably high probability that you would also like Rationally Speaking.
Adjust your priors.
And and then, I mean, one project that I kind of want to go back to that I've been doing before COVID is what I was calling the update project, where I was trying to figure out best practices for getting experts with differing opinions to understand each other's models and hopefully update a little bit collectively in the direction of truth. So nice. I felt like I was making some pretty good progress on that, and then COVID hit and made it hard. Yeah. But I definitely want to pursue that direction again.
I love when I hear people, just average people that know nothing about any of this stuff, go, "Oh, I'm updating my priors." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So this kind of Bayesian reasoning language is kind of infiltrated.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not officially Bayesian.
Yeah,
and sometimes people grouse at me like, "Well, it's you're not like technically doing Bayesian updating. You're just changing your mind," which is yes, it's a colloquial adaptation of the term I'm borrowing. But I do think it's like a valuable way to think about changing your mind.
Yeah, totally.
And way to think about incorporating evidence that works better than just saying like, oh, I should change my mind sometimes. So anyway, I talk about that a lot too. I have a YouTube channel, if you look for me on YouTube, where I talk about, I kind of defend the value of like the colloquial meaning of Bayesian thinking against its detractors. So you can check that out.
We'll put links to all that down below in the show notes. Julia, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for the great really interesting conversation. Super fun,
interesting.
Likewise. That hour and 45 minutes went by really fast. All right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so it did.